This video was sponsored by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. This video was also brought to you by my premium tutorials on Gumroad. If you'd like to watch my longer form videos, you can do so by purchasing them at gumroad.com/moderndayjames. This month, I'll be releasing part 4 of my character design series, as well as the character design bundle. So today's video will be a follow-up to the first Bridgman video where I gave an overview of the principles we could learn from the book. Today we'll start to get into specifics by looking at the bony and muscular anatomy of the trunk of the body. So we'll start by assessing the two major forms of the trunk of the body, that being the rib cage and the pelvis. Since these two forms are pretty complicated, it will benefit us to think of them as simplified forms. For the ribcage, I use an egg-like form that has a semicircular chunk removed from the bottom. And for the pelvis, I use a rectangular prism that's about 2/3 the height of the ribcage. Think of these forms as tools that will help us understand how to reposition these masses in space. Bridgman uses both this form and a slightly modified version to study the masses of the body. These modified forms more accurately depict the contour of the ribcage and pelvis, as well as the abdominal muscles that span the gap between them. Once you're comfortable drawing this organic form, you can add more dynamics by curving that intermediate abdominal region. This abdomen is going to stretch and squash to manipulate the positions of the two bony masses. So when you go to take a big stretch back, your rib cage pulls back and the abdomen is completely stretched out. And when you pull the rib cage forward, the abdomen is squashed in a very uncomfortable crunch position. For this section, it's really important to understand how to manipulate organic forms. So if you're not comfortable with this, be sure to head to my perspective series, which is currently a 6-part series. If we take a closer look at the forms of the abdomen, we can use two large curves that are spaced out with a smaller curve in between them. This form will span from the bottom of the rib cage all the way down into the pubic region of the pelvis. It's also an extremely dynamic area, so its shape will change with the movement of those forms of the body. Lastly, we'll take a look at the back view. The primary element of note, in my opinion, is how the tendons of the back span the ribcage and pelvis in the lower back. You can take advantage of this to show some overlap. Once you feel comfortable drawing these masses and manipulating them, we can make the drawings look more realistic by sketching only what can be observed on the surface. That isn't to say that we ignore what's underneath, but rather we'll use the shadows created by the bones and muscles to dictate our line placement. I'll use all the tools discussed in part 1 to make this appear more dynamic, so I'm going to emphasize the overlapping of the rib cage into the silhouette. You can see I continue those lines inside the body. And just in the same way, I distinguish between the body of a muscle and its tendon by allowing the tendons to overlap inside the body of the muscle. If you look over at the muscle shapes on the right, you can see that a majority of the upper chest is dominated by the Pectoralis Major. This muscle originates at the sternum and clavicle, and it inserts in the upper arm. It functions to bring the arms forward in a pushing motion, so you can see that when the arms are actually elevated, its shape ends up being stretched out. I personally like to exaggerate the overlap of the tendinous portion of the muscle onto its body, so you can see that I'm continuing those lines from the arm all the way inside the silhouette of the pec. The next muscle I want to draw your attention to is the Serratus anterior muscle. You'll see it more pronounced in the profile view, but this muscle acts to tether the shoulder blade to the rib cage. You can see it inserting between the individual ribs. Inserting in between these Serratus anterior muscles is the external oblique, which stretches all the way from the rib cage down onto the upper portion of the pelvis. You'll see that I once again exaggerate that overlap of the tendinous portion of the muscle to the body of the muscle mass. If we take a closer look at the armpit, you'll see that it's created by the junction of a bunch of muscles into a very condensed space. The inside of the armpit is created by the tendon of the bicep, the rib cage, and the serratus anterior muscles. The Latissimus Dorsi muscle, which originates on the back, and the tricep create the back wall of the armpit, with the pectoralis and deltoid muscles creating the roof. And yes, apparently I don't know how to spell the word tricep. The central mass of the abdomen comes from the rectus abdominis muscle. As I mentioned earlier, it's subject to the stretch and squash forces of the ribs and pelvis. You'll see that as I tilt the rib cage to the right side, I add a lot more contour and squashing forces to that side of the muscle. Alright, now let's have a look at the torso in a profile view. When the arm is elevated, you can see the bulk of the latissimus, which spans from the back all the way to the front of the upper arm. The shoulder blade will also make a prominent depression on the back. The contour of the back is produced by a combination of the ribcage itself, as well as the latissimus and underlying erector spinae muscles. From this angle, the relationship of the serratus anterior and external oblique become a bit more obvious. And it's also a bit more clear to see how the serratus anterior is pulling that scapula towards the ribcage. Once again, you can see that I'm emphasizing the underlying ribcage forms. That overlap between the ribcage and the rectus abdominis muscle really adds a lot of depth and volume to the figure. Adding some perpendicular hatching in between the serratus anterior helps show that interweaving of the serratus and external oblique. Alright, now let's move on to the back view of the torso. The majority of the back is taken up by the Latissimus Dorsi muscle, As I mentioned before, this muscle spans from the pelvis all the way to the front side of the upper arm. Its main function is to pull the upper arm down towards the body, so when you lift your arms above your head, it becomes stretched out. Since the tendons of the latissimus insert in the center of the lower back, you can see that there's an overlap created between that muscle and the external oblique. Much less prominent are the four muscles that sit on top of the scapula, which we'll talk about in the following section. However, the underside of the shoulder blade itself stands out quite prominently. The dagger-shaped trapezius muscle originates at the center of the back, travels up and above the scapula and on top of the shoulders, and then extends all the way to the base of the head. Since this muscle is so large and has several parts, it has a bunch of different functions, from shrugging the shoulders to pulling the head backwards. Interlocking with the trapezius and resting above the scapula is the triangular deltoid muscle. Its main function is to elevate the arm, and when doing so, that makes its shape much more compressed and circular. Just like the way we distinguished between the body of a muscle and its tendon, we can do the same with stretched and flexed muscles. In this last drawing, I'm trying to overly accentuate that relationship of the latissimus and the external oblique that I mentioned earlier. The person is also pulling both of their scapulas back, so it ends up compressing that trapezius, which is sandwiched in between them. Another notable feature is the depression in the lower back that's created by those underlying erector spinae muscles. Since the person is also very lean, you can actually see the shapes of those scapular muscles. Alright, lastly, let's have a look at the shoulder girdle. The shoulder girdle is a combination of the scapula and clavicles, which are separated from the main skeleton. This gives them a lot of mobility to move freely around the rib cage. Bridgman demonstrates this relationship as a rectangular form that sits above the trapezoidal rib cage. The top plane of the shoulders is comprised of the interlocking deltoid and trapezius muscles. The shape of the trapezius leaves a little bit of a gap between it and the clavicle. There are a few underlying muscles such as the platysma which fill in that gap, but it does leave a distinct depression on the shoulder. There are four muscles that I alluded to earlier that sit on top of the scapula. You tend not to see them unless the figure is super lean, and when you do, you typically see the infraspinatus and the teres major. Alright everybody, that's about it for this video. I'd like to take a moment just to thank our sponsor, Squarespace. If you're looking to build an online portfolio, consider using Squarespace. They have beautifully designed templates that have been crafted by Squarespace's world-class design team. Adding images into your website is as simple as dragging and dropping them from your desktop into your browser window. Any images hosted on Squarespace can be edited directly within your browser using Squarespace's built-in image editor. Crop, resize, rotate, adjust the brightness, and much more. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, Go to squarespace.com/moderndayjames to save 10% off on your first purchase. And be sure to use the coupon code ModernDayJames. Thanks again for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please click like and subscribe with notifications on. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by heading to patreon.com/moderndayjames. There we have many great perks like access to Gumroads at a discounted price, group lessons, and one-on-one lessons. Take care, everybody, and I will see you in the next video.